Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Maples and this is Literally Graphic. And today we are going to be looking at a nonfiction slice of life comic about an art teacher in a Toronto drop-in center. Content warnings include Lapp being a bystander to bullying and what I suspect is behavior of a child who has been sexually abused, although that's never addressed in the text itself. Drop-In by Dave Lapp was published in Canada by Conundrum Press in 2008 and gifted to me a couple of years ago. It was nominated in 2009 for the Ignatz Award, Outstanding Graphic Novel, and for Doug Wright's Awards Best Books. An excerpt was also published in Best American Comics 2010, which strikes me as a bit odd, but whatever. I'm having a hard time tracking down much about Dave Lapp, but he is also a character in Drop-In. From this representation of himself, Lapp appears to see himself as a pretty basic white guy from the suburbs where nothing bad ever happens. He has a brother, decent at art, and pretty chill. Flipping the book over, as we do, Drop-In is described as follows. Similar in tone to the legendary comic series Duplex Planet, Lapp's first graphic novel is a collection of stories about his work as an art teacher in an inner-city Toronto youth drop-in center. His students are full of stories which they are eager to share. These include a family who picks worms at night on their knees, Vietnamese refugees, rope-jumping girls, Venus flytraps, bullies, and tamagotchis. With a warmth of line and uniquely charming storytelling style, Lapp's comics evoke the work of Chester Brown and his black humor that of Joe Ollmann. The art style that Lapp uses is pretty striking with dark, dramatic lines. I can't help but mention that the rigid four-frame page layout reminds me a lot of Chester Brown, with maybe a bit less personal detail and more zoomed in on the characters. He also thanks Joe Ollmann, a Hamilton cartoonist, in the dedication. This book is extremely accessible to not-comic readers and might be a good way to introduce someone to the medium. That said, I definitely have mixed feelings about this collection of stories. For one, upon finishing this book, I flipped straight back to the metrics page to see if there were any notes about name changes or permissions to tell these people's stories, but nothing. I certainly hope it's safe to assume that Lapp has done something and isn't just publishing about other people willy-nilly. It certainly would have set a good example for others who might be inspired by this book and been reassuring to the rest of us who care about the huge difference in power presented in these situations. While this might feel like nitpicking, because I'm always worried I'm nitpicking too much, I feel like the way Lapp and the kids he works with are presented is concerning. While he is presented with some personality and his internal voice narrates many of the stories, there are still a lot of ways that Lapp is presented as the self-insert character with everyone else as other. A fish out of water. Nothing that happens in front of Lapp relates to anything else in his life. While sexuality is not touched on at all, there's a pretty good percent of people who apparently fall fully on one side or the other of the gender binary, with stories often featuring a lot of girls. There is one character who appears to be intellectually disabled, although I honestly don't know how this relates to best language practices, so I will be looking into that. Anyway, the only disability representation was this man who had harassed little girls. As someone who has only recently started working through all of my ableist ideas and biases, it was sadly relatable to not be sure what to do when someone who I perceive as more difficult to communicate with acts out. That said, setting up the only person who has disabilities as a kind of dangerous predator on young girls without any resolution is bad. Or, seems to indicate that Lapp is incapable of providing safe space for children. Class and race are also not treated that well, in my humble opinion. Not to say that Lapp should not have shared stories about the poor racialized people he works with, although again I would circle back to checking how they feel about these stories, but that as a more white person who comes from a middle class background, the way that these points are used to present everyone else as other is highly problematic. Similar to the stories I highlighted for the disability representation, there's another story now outside of Lapp's purview about the two girls who wear hijabs who bully other girls at school quite violently. Not to say nothing like this would ever happen, but it seemed in very poor taste and adds nothing to the world. Before I conclude, I guess I would recognize that there are lots of limits on what Lapp could do personally, all levels of government are complicit in poverty and often use it as an implicit threat against all people who fall outside of poverty to be sure to stay in line and keep working away productively. As I often say, it's difficult to critique people's real life, but Lapp, along with many others, and in contrast to the rest of us, have chosen to put these words down on the page and share what is happening around them. And while not every story made me deeply uncomfortable, and not everything needs an easily identifiable point, the lackadaisical nature of the book lets all of my negative feelings really boil to the top, because there's no counterpoints to hold on to. I rated this book 2 out of 5 stars. Geez, thanks God, that's over. Bye y'all, keep reading and resist white supremacy. And as always, Literally Graphic is recorded on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation. I live here because of British colonization, Indigenous genocide, and more geographically specific, Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase, which was finalized in 1805 between representatives of the Crown and certain Mississauga peoples. This treaty was a lie and has since been broken many times over. Saying so reflects only my own small steps towards knowing the truth and does nothing for reconciliation.